there were 3 or 4 of us actually giving a talk on our exchanges, this thing's going with Srila Prabhupada, and there were a few points that I didn't have the time to bring up. Shivananda was mentioned earlier. Shivananda was the temple president in Montreal, Canada, which is where I joined. I joined in Montreal and actually started going to the temple in Montreal and actually moved into 26 Second Avenue about 6 months later. But while I was in the university, I was going on weekends to visit Montreal. Hansadutta, Hemavati, as well as Shivananda were all there. The first time I walked into the temple, I had no idea what I was walking into. I was simply doing research on this new Hindu temple. And Shivananda and I struck up a conversation, and I had some questions, and most of them were, of course, challenging questions. Just trying to understand also, and just inquiries. And then after conversing for a few minutes, he said, "So do you want to see God?" And I said, sure. Why, is he here? He said, yes. So he led me over in the Montreal temple. There was a bowling alley, and there were just simply curtains everywhere. The rooms were simply divisions within the bowling alley made of curtains. And the deities were behind one such curtain. And of course I didn't know what a deity was or anything, but I was about to find out. So I walked, and he opened the curtain, and he did his full dandavats. And being from a conservative Christian background, I genuflected to these deities, or to a Lord Jagannath who was standing there like this. It was huge, Lord Jagannath. And so that was my first exposure to Krishna consciousness and to the deity. And shortly after that, I joined the temple, and I just gave these stories the other day, so if anyone was here, you heard them. But I'm going to jump ahead past the experiences I had in 26 Second Avenue with Brahmananda and different things, and go to the West Coast. After I left 26 Second Avenue, I hitchhiked across country. I was already a devotee by then. In fact, I was already initiated, but I wanted to see the West Coast. Everybody there was California dreaming, so to speak, so even devotees had that penchant to move west. So I went to I ended up in Seattle and went with the Sankirtan party down to LA, and it was just at the point where the temple that was, let me see if I get this right, it was on La Cienega Boulevard. It was a storefront, and we were going out on Harinam every night, and for several hours. I really wasn't very good at it. I tried it, but at any rate, because all the devotees had come there, I guess there was some problem with the landlord, and they also had just purchased Watsika, the big temple. So we moved over to Watsika, and I helped with that a little bit. But that's a long way to set the stage for my exchange with Srila Prabhupada, where he got angry at me. I used to do some service for Prabhupada. I was always kind of back on 26 Second Avenue, as well as in LA. I was always pretty good with my hands. So if there was a squeaky door or something, some shelf or something needed to be built or fixed, that was my service to Srila Prabhupada. He would call, or his assistant or servant would have me go and do whatever needed to be done. Well, so that's also setting the scene for what I'm about to say. There were a lot of devotees. It was kind of a confused state, and there were a lot of new devotees coming at that time. And in particular, there was this one young brahmacharini that had a very young baby. The baby wasn't more than a couple months old, maybe even younger than that. I was a brahmachari. I didn't know anything about this. But I was enamored. I'm a protective sort of soul. So when I saw this, I was kind of attracted. You know, this is little cute baby and his mother. And so we did what most devotees, how they would progress in any kind of a relationship. You would chant japa together, or you would eat prasadam together. So after doing that for about 2 weeks, it was as good as done. You were going to have to you were marrying this person. This is all there was to it. You know, that kind of association in those days was tantamount to, okay, you're really serious now. So, okay, you know, I'm 20 years old, and she was probably 17 or 18. She had a baby. And then my brahmachari friends gathered around me after the word got out that you really got to think this through, Bhamandev, because you know, you really want a ready-made family, you know, and you're kind of young for this. So I thought, geez, how am I going to get out of this? I mean, what can I do? So I did what any conniving brahmachari did. I said, Prabhupada said that if you have a child, you should be satisfied. This is what I told the brahmacharini. And therefore, he said that that you should be satisfied. So I'm not going to marry you. I'm not, you know, I just, you know, I think we should just call it off. You be satisfied. I'll just stay where I am. And you know, Prabhupada said that it's better this way. So she kind of took it in, and about 3 or 4 hours later, apparently she had gone to her girlfriends, you know, her god sisters. I don't think, she was not initiated, but she went to her god sisters and said, you know, that Prabhupada said she couldn't marry Vamadev. And I didn't know this was going on at all. So what happened was I got a call, which wasn't really unusual. I got calls, you know, a few times a week. It wasn't a big deal. But this was a big deal because the call was from Prabhupada. I mean, not that it wasn't a big deal, but I didn't suspect anything. I suspected Prabhupada wanted to see me to fix something. And in a sense, he did. So he called me, and I got in the room, offered my obeisance, says, how can I serve you? And he said, did I tell you not to marry this girl? And I said, excuse me, Srila Prabhupada? Did I tell you not to marry this girl? And I said, oh no, Prabhupada, you know, we never talked about it, you know. And then he just lambasted me. He told me just flat out, he said, never use your spiritual master for your own purposes. Don't ever do this. Now you must leave town. You got to go now. Govindadasi has to get to be with Gorsindar in Hawaii, so I kind of got to go to Hawaii. She needs all of her bags. She's got a lot of paraphernalia, so you have to, you know, move, you know, escort her there to the airport, get all the stuff, and deliver her to her husband. So I said, yes, Prabhupada, I'll be glad to do that. So that's how I got to Hawaii, and then that's a true story. I ended up at the airport, and there's a few other little anecdotal stories. After I got there was a storefront about half the size of this room. Maybe the front of it was only about 6 feet deep, where you came in, and then you had paraphernalia, and the back was just a small room, and that was the temple in those days. That's all there was. So and it was on the second floor of this mall kind of area. So I brought everything upstairs, and then Gorsindar, who was the husband, Govindadasi's husband, said, okay, thank you very much. This is 9, 10 o'clock at night. And I said, okay, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, the beach is down that way. So I said, okay. So I just took my backpack and my bedroll, because in those days you really didn't have much more than that, and went down to the beach, found a high bit of ground right near, not too far from the water. I could see the water. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was woken up by a big wave. And all my stuff was floating in all different directions. So apparently I went a little bit too close, and the tide had been out. And that was my first night in Hawaii. And it went from bad to worse the second night. By the second night, I had purchased a junky car. It didn't have brakes, but it was a station wagon. And I figured my plan was to park it in the parking lot in front of the temple. So I got the thing. Barely got it there because it was only $150. That was not a very expensive car. And that was about all the money I had besides some gas money. It had ball tires and no brakes. But I parked it there and I put all the seats down and I made a little brahmachari ashram. I mean, that was my sleeping quarters for the night. And of course you had to have incense and stuff. So in those days they had this stuff called dupe. Is anyone familiar with dupe? It's like it's actually, you could buy it. It was like a paste, and you roll it, and you put it on something that hopefully doesn't burn, and you just light it. And then I went to sleep, and my kopin, I just in the back there, and incense was coming out of the thing, and I was sound asleep about 11 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden there was lights on me, and I saw blue lights flashing around, and of course I wasn't indecent, but by most standards it wasn't very acceptable what I was wearing. So, but they told me to get out of the car, and I said, well, let me get my yogi pants on, let me get something, and he wouldn't let, because just all they had was a kopin. So they got out, and the police, there was 3 or 4 police there, and they made me put my hands up, and he says, what's that smell? And I said, it's dupe. That wasn't the right thing to say in Hawaii back in 1968 or 69. You don't tell them you got dupe in your car. So they called for backup, and another paddy wagon came, and this is my second night in Hawaii. So, but luckily, by the time the paddy wagon, before they loaded me up and everything, one cop that was a little bit more intelligent than the other ones whispered in his ear something to the effect that that's incense. That's not dope. It's incense. It's dupe. So they let me off. He just told me to park, 2 blocks away where it was off his beat. So I just spent the rest of the night in relative peace. Anyway, let me see if there's any other stories of any interest. Maybe another story where I had a direct interaction with Srila Prabhupada again. It was a couple of weeks later. I was working at the time, and Prabhupada actually agreed for me to do this. I joined the Carpenters Union. They needed builders. I was good with my hands, as I mentioned, but I didn't have any formal training. So I joined the union. I was working as a carpenter. And lo and behold, I went to the temple after not having gone for a few days because I was working 14-hour days. And the temple was no longer there. They had moved on the other side of the island. But I couldn't find that out for about 2 weeks. And Prabhupada was on the island. I just didn't know where he was. And I finally asked around and found out that he was over in Kaava. They had rented a farmhouse. And so here I'm trying to get to Kaaba with this old beat-up station wagon, which is a pretty good, you had to go over a mountain. And as I mentioned, I didn't have brakes, so that was kind of fun. I used the low gear and tried not to get going too fast, but I used the emergency brake. So I got there, and when I got there, they were making lunch for Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada heard my voice, and he asked me if that was me, and he said, where have you been? And I said, I was doing carpentry, I'm working, and he says, okay, you chanting? And I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. He said, oh, very good. So he just wanted to make sure that I was still chanting, and I was still, I explained to him I didn't know where the temple was. I couldn't find it for a while. So then he gave me some prasadam. He was just finishing lunch. So let me think if there's another direct. The only other, a lot of the other association I had with Srila Prabhupada was through letters. I had several letters from Srila Prabhupada, especially when I later on in 1970 started the St. Louis Temple. There was a lot of correspondence. Prabhupada was very encouraged by householders going out in any fashion, just to go to where there's no temple. He said, all you need, every householder needs an apartment. Just vacate one room as a temple and invite people to chant and take prasadam. He said, it's very simple. Then you have a center. There's nothing fancy. You don't need funding. You don't need all kinds of stuff. You just need to, you need the function of a household. So someone, so there's cooking going on, there's cleaning, there's money being made, there's, certain function. and you got to live anyway, so you got just make room, make an extra room. And in St. Louis, we did that in a fashion. We had a 3-room apartment, and they were all 3 the same size, and it was a rented apartment. And when we rented it, it had a large window. It was first floor. That's the only reason I rented it, because it was the first floor, and it had 2 stories above it. And on this side, so there was 2 apartments, one in the rear that we didn't rent. We just shared the bathroom in the rear with the small apartment there, and we had 3 rooms. And that was replicated twice on top of us, and then beside us, the mirror image of it. So there was actually 2, 4, 6. There were 12 apartments in this building, and we put on the front window Sri Radhakrishna Temple. It looked like we owned the whole building. We had 3 rooms and rented the 3 rooms and shared a bathroom. And the 3 rooms, the first room was the living room, second room was probably a bedroom, but we used it as part of the first room, a living room, and then the kitchen, which was large, is where we had all our dressers and bed, everything was in the kitchen, because first we got bumped out of the second room because too many people started coming. In those days, Krishna consciousness exploded. You went to a town, started chanting Hare Krishna, you handed out leaflets, you handed out BTGs, and people just came in droves. You know, it was nothing to have 50 or 75 people after just a few weeks coming to your Sunday feast. And we soon outgrew that. But Prabhupada really, really loved the idea of householders opening temples. It was that stage in the movement. When that temple was opened, I believe there were, I could start lying and I don't want to do that, but there was somewhere around 30 temples in 1970 when I opened St. Louis. And there was a proposal. I have a letter that was addressed to Harigriva, Pradyumna, and myself, where we proposed to open up 16 more. So one of them was St. Louis. I immediately opened up St. Louis after that letter of approval. But it was a young movement. There wasn't that many temples, and Prabhupada was really happy when the temple was open. So he wrote me several times. He encouraged me when they had back the Godhead distribution. We were up to a whooping 3,000 magazines a month. And we thought that was pretty good, but we find out some people were doing that in a few days, and sometimes even a day, the bigger temples. But I was working full time, and I just had a few devotees. It's ironic. Today I just got an email from who's a Bhakta Joe, who's one of the first devotees. I got it on Facebook. I got connected with him today. And I hadn't heard from him in over 40 years. So I haven't responded yet because I haven't had internet. And I can't even remember his devotee name, but I remember he and his brother both came at the same time. At any rate, more stories about Prabhupada. Another story was the purchase of the land. I'll give you this one quick, and if some of you heard it the other day, we needed to get out of that temple building, and because we were having too many people come, and the people were really upset that were all around us because we were having rip-roaring kirtans, and they were banging on the ceiling and banging on the walls, and the landlord lived in the same apartment next door, which is really not a good idea if you're running a Hare Krishna temple, to have your landlord right next door. And so he basically stopped taking our rent, in effect telling us we had to move. So that was all right, because I didn't want to be there. It was getting too small anyway. But he wanted us to move right away. So he thought we were going to move within 30 days. Well, we refused because we didn't have a place to move. So he got angry, and he started trying to put pressure on us and stuff. And then, I won't say Krishna did it, but he had a heart attack and died. And so we didn't have to worry about the landlord for a few more months. And managed to scrape out enough money to buy a house about 4 doors down. And that's the first St. Louis temple. We bought it off, owner financing, because we had no credit. I was 21, 22 years old at the time. And on that, I'll either take questions or just, if there's anything, because it's getting a little late. Anybody have any questions or any comments? Anything? Do you have? Well, we have there was one mention, and this is, please don't take this as self-serving or whatever, but Padarajani was just reminding me of a letter. I just was going with the help of Vedabase. You can find all these letters. There's thousands and thousands of letters, most of which I had totally forgotten that I'd gotten from Srila Prabhupada. But back in the early 70s, of course, the movement was for you to give your child to Gurukula, to put the kids in school. You had to educate your children, and so we were asked to. We had a son that. Oh, that's another story too. Before my son was born, this shows you how personal Srila Prabhupada can be. Before my son was born, I wrote him a letter. I said, Srila Prabhupada, we're going to have a child, within a month or so, month and a half. We would like you to name the child if you could, if you would. And Srila Prabhupada said, oh, certainly. And well, he wrote a lot of other, that was at the end of a letter to him, and there was a lot of other technical stuff about book. I would write him often about statistics, how the temple's going, who's coming, whatever. And at the end, I asked him to name my child. And so at the end of his letter, and concerning the birth of your child, when your child is born, you can name the child Jagannath, Das, or Dasi, accordingly. So that was before ultrasound and stuff. At least we didn't take advantage of ultrasound. And so he just said Das or Dasi. So that was pretty personal and pretty nice. Now this Jagannath got a little old. He was all of 2 or almost 3 years old. So there was already pressure to send him to Gurukula. And there was also pressure in the early 70s that anybody that sent their child, once they sent them to Gurukula, of course, the next step is, well, the husband should take sannyas. My wife got wind of this, and she was a little bit taken aback, so she did what any self-respecting disciple would do. She wrote Srila Prabhupada. Said, you want me to give up my son, and now my husband, you want him to take sannyas. And that was the gist of her letter. It was written a lot more eloquently and respectfully. But Srila Prabhupada wrote back, he said, you have deities in your home. You are both Vaishnavas, you're both devotees. So your child is already living in a temple. You can raise your child, he can live with you. And he says, your husband is he has nothing to do besides serve Krishna. He is 100% devotee, he's serving Krishna, he's running the temple, doing this stuff. So he is already a sannyasi. He is a householder sannyasi. So I will not grant him sannyas order at any time. Be rest assured. So I figured, boy, I'm dead. Haribol. And that letter is in writing, signed by Prabhupada, and it's quoted very often. Haribol.